Hey everyone, Phobos here, coming at you with another video, and this time we're going to be talking in a more general sense about supports, and we're pretty much going to be talking about supports in games like, Overwatch, League of Legends, the meta esports games at the moment, I guess. Um, the Overwatch League sort of inspired me to start talking about this because I've seen some conversations arise in some of the subreddits about supports and stuff like that. So that's pretty much why I'm making this video. But yeah, the main topic for today is going to be why you shouldn't main support, and that's kind of, I guess, provocative, but there's some caveats here, right? So the first one, obviously, is that this is only we're talking about in a competitive sense for people trying to improve and rank up higher on the competitive ladder. Obviously, if you're just playing the game for fun, if you like the way Mercy looks or something, if you like one of her skins or if you just like the play style or something like that and you're just playing for fun with your friends, none of this really applies to you at all, obviously, because then you just have a completely different purpose playing the game, and that's absolutely fine. Nobody's trying to be elitist here or anything. We're just talking about particularly in a competitive sense and trying to improve. And so there's that. And then the other part is we're not talking about support champions that are being played as carries, right? So, like, obviously in these games, the developers design champions they think they're going to be used for one purpose, and they sometimes get used for another. So if the champion's like just because it's tagged support, I guess, doesn't necessarily mean that it is a support champion, right? So I think Lux, at least at some point in League of Legends history, was tagged as support, or at least partially support slash mage, because she has like a shielding ability or something like that, and they just tag anything that has kind of like utility abilities like that as part support. But in reality, like Lux primarily gets played as a carry. So we wouldn't be talking about if you're playing Lux in a carry in mid lane, we're not talking about you here. Like it's not like you're not a support main at that point because you're playing Lux. And it actually goes the other way as well, I think. So like if you're taking a champion like Syndra and you're playing a bot lane, uh, that doesn't make you a carry, right? At that point, you're still a support because you're basically denying resources from yourself, which would help you impact the game. So yeah, you wouldn't be playing a carry in that situation. You'd be basically functioning as a support, and you'd be better off playing that champion in mid lane. Is like the argument that I'm going to try and make to you. Um, so yeah, those are the two main points I want to get out of the way right at the beginning. And then I guess we'll just go through the list here. And the first point is going to be pretty much fundamental to this whole video, I guess. The no damage, no impact. Now, what I mean by this, obviously it's kind of vague, so I'll expand upon it a bit, is that in all these competitive games, pretty much you're going to be the objective is to do damage and basically kill the players in the opposing team, right? Now, of course, you're going to say that these are objective games and there are objectives on the map, right? It's not only kills. Kills aren't all what's important, but the whole point I'm trying to make is that you have to be able to kill your opponent, right? It doesn't mean that you have to kill your opponent in every circumstance. So there are like high-level Korean LoL games, for example, where there's very few kills that go back and forth between the two teams, and yet it may be like 30 minutes or something, one team is up 5 to 10k gold, or just for an example, right? And obviously not much damage is being exchanged here. So what I mean by no damage, no impact, well, they're still threatening damage, right? Um, they're playing the lane, they're playing the game in a manner which they're putting themselves in a position to be very effective against the team that they put down this 5 to 10k gold, right? So they're contesting the objectives, but the other team can't really contest back either because of the positioning or the heroes, the amount of farm they have, the time of the game, you know what I mean? So there's a lot of different factors that can go into this, but we're not just talking about literally doing damage, we're talking about the potential to do damage to set up your team to do damage, right? Because damage is the only way you can really like force somebody off an objective, right? Like you can't if everybody was just around like healing each other and using utility abilities, there'd be no actual fighting for any of these mechanics, right? Like damage is the one thing that can turn the tide of the game into your favor, being able to do damage or actually just doing it. So damage is a very important thing, and typically supports don't really. You could say that they facilitate damage dealing in the sense that they heal the damage dealers in some case, or they provide utility to make it easier for them to do damage, but they're not a direct damage threat themselves. And that means that you generally have less control over what's going on in the game, right? So you have less impact because you have no ability to direct damage onto a specific target that needs to die. Uh, you can't spontaneously do damage to help your team like win the team fight or something like that. Like if your carries are bad at doing damage, you're not putting any pressure on the other team, right? So if that's generally how a lot of these fights will go, right? It's like both sides are applying pressure to each other with their damage dealers, and then one side is basically going to break because they falter to the other team's pressure. I'm thinking of back to like WoW Arena, right? Like if there's no damage going out on a team, they're free to pretty much operate how they want, to set up how they want. You know what I mean? And they're applying pressure on you. And when you're having pressure applied on yourself, it's forcing you to play the game a certain way, to react a different way. So damage. My point here is just damage is very important. And being able to control the damage, hence being a damage dealer, or being a tank which can directly facilitate damage dealing, is super important in all these games. I think it's very undervalued because there tends to be this. It's kind of like a false equivalency, I would say, where people say like, oh, supports have just as much impact as the damage dealers because the damage dealers do the damage, but the supports do the healing. So if there's no supports, you know, you wouldn't be able to get healed, you wouldn't be able to do your damage or something like that. But it's sort of just missing the point because the damage is what's really driving how the game is played, right? And the healing is just kind of mitigating as much as possible, like how much you're forced to react in a given situation, I guess. And this sort of ties in with the second point. So with the mechanical ability, um, players who have very high mechanical ability, typically you want on the damage dealers because they can output the most damage and put the most pressure again on the enemy team, right? So you want people on your team that are going to be doing the most pressure. And as support, like the counter argument is going to come back and say, oh, but if you have a good support, they're going to be mitigating the pressure from the great damage dealer, right? But this is like where the problem fundamentally comes in, is that a support can't really do as much in most of these games to mitigate the healing, right? Like there's not like a one for one. Like if you have a McCree that's just like hitting shot after shot after shot, there's nothing you can do as Lucio that's going to like really make you heal faster in any given situation, right? Like if this McCree on the enemy team is like a top 200 McCree or something, and he's just going off and he's ripping through your team and he's hitting headshot after headshot after headshot, and like what are you gonna do there? Like what makes you different than if you're like a top 500 Lucio there? What makes you really different from a top 1,000, a top 2,000 Lucio? You know, how are you going to be able to stop your team from bleeding essentially to this McCree because he's just so much better than your team's DPS, where he doesn't have the pressure applied to him, and he can just go off and start shooting anybody he wants on your team and just absolutely wreck them, right? There's no way you can get more out of being a support, and that's the problem, is that a lot of these supports are focused on utility abilities, and just like the way they are designed inherently means that there's less you can do mechanically to impact the game, because your level of mechanics, I guess, doesn't scale with the output of utility. It's more like you just use the utility, and then it's used or something like that. You know what I mean? There's certain places you can use it where it's better used than others, but your actual mechanical input in playing the game, in terms of like how you're clicking in League or like how you're aiming in Overwatch, typically doesn't really factor into like the amount of utility you're going to be able to bring to the table. You know what I mean? And so that's like a big problem. It just gives you a lot less impact. And then number 3, less game understanding. So this is basically, you could apply this in some way to like any sort of one trick, I guess, in any game, where you're going to say that if they only play that hero or champion or that role, then they're going to have less understanding of the game entirely. And that's a very valid point to make, right? But I think supports are put an extra disadvantage in some sense, because they're not only are they playing only from their own perspective, but since they're not the ones applying any pressure to the enemy team They don't understand like really the nuances of how certain team comps kind of get broken or how you would beat them, like where you apply the pressure on the team or something like that. Like even somebody who's like one tricking Tracer or something is going to probably end up understanding the game better than somebody who's a one trick Mercy, because the Tracer's job is basically they have to get down the champions in a specific order on the enemy team in order to win, right? And if they're in order to climb, they need to figure out the optimal order in a broad number of situations on how to break down enemy team comp. And if they can't do that, then they just fail to climb, right? So if you're having success as a DPS, like you are trial and erroring, you're learning more about the game, you're learning where you have to probe, where you have to sit back, and stuff like that. Whereas if you're playing support, you're basically just kind of focusing on your own play and like helping out your teammates in any context you can, but it's not really the same as playing a DPS. And it kind of goes to point 5. I know we're kind of skipping ahead a bit here. But what you're doing is you're more like learning your champion and not the game, right? So obviously, like there's going to be it's going to take time to pick up from like one champion or hero in one of these games from another, right? And that's like an argument people are going to make against like, oh well, you are learning the game because you're learning what to do in certain situations and stuff, but really it's just like you're more learning all that stuff specific to one champion or specific to one role, and you're not really understanding in most cases how the game works at a macro level just from playing, unless obviously like you're digesting content on the side that's helping you do that, right? I'm talking about like obviously anybody can do that, but I'm talking about what you're going to learn from actually just playing the game itself. And so point number 4 is just kind of going into, it actually should have probably been grouped with the other points, in the sense that what I mean by support's impact can be difficult to quantify unless you're missing a support is that another common argument that's always cited with support users is basically like, oh well, if you're a support, or if your team doesn't have supports, right? That's the argument that gets made. Like, oh, supports are super important because if you didn't have your Lucio and your Mercy and the other team did, then your team's just going to get rolled over. And it's like, well, yeah, there's like an inherent level of impact, but what we're talking about is how much you can impact the game aside from your champion existing in the game, right? So, like a Lucio, for example, it's like, yeah, not having the Lucio is the major problem. But once you have the Lucio, we're talking about the degree of impact. How much can you separate yourself from other Lucios? You know what I mean? A lot of the abilities are very intuitive to use, and like you'll kind of get the hang of learning the champion as the game goes on. But then once you hit that point, there's kind of like a bit of a soft ceiling there, where there's only certain players that are going to truly be exceptional on that champion. And for most other players, they're going to be all kind of like, they're going to be capped out their impact at a certain point, right? It's not like you can always aim better or something, always position yourself better as the DPS to do like a ton more damage in a fight. It's kind of, I feel like you hit the soft cap a lot sooner on support, where, yeah, if your character's existing in the game, you're already providing an inherent amount of impact, but then amplifying that impact past that certain point is just a lot more difficult on support. And then the high ELO number 6, I guess, this is like the general point that I'm trying to make, is that rather than be a support player, I would try and pick a more impactful role, and then you can always learn support after that, right? Like, nothing is going to stop you from learning the mechanics of playing Mercy or Lucio or something like nothing. Like, if you're good mechanically at the game, that can only be a boon to you in support. You know what I mean? There's no detriment for being mechanically better than somebody else in the support role, right? It can only help you. So there's no point in only trying to be a support main. Just try and work on all aspects of your gameplay, all your mechanics and stuff like that. And then if you want to learn support so that you can fill into those situations where your team needs a support or something like that, that's absolutely fine. Um, but I would much rather, if I had to like pick a support for a team or something, I would much rather actually go on the ladder and take like a high level DPS player or like a carry player, like in League, like a mid laner or something, like a high LP challenger mid, and try and like convert them into a support than just take a high LP challenger support, because the mid laner is just going to know more about the game in general. They're going to have better mechanics, and it's just very easy to mold them into a support, whereas the support player, they're just going to hit like a limit, right, a lot quicker. Like we've already seen that this DPS player has like maybe really good mechanics or decision making in some aspects because they're high on the ladder, right? And they wouldn't be able to be that high if they're shouldering all the responsibility and they're failing in those areas, right? Because that would be exposed and they would be sent back down the ladder at some point. Um, to hit like their true skill level. Whereas support, it's a lot easier for them to basically still get carried up these ladders by good DPS players, and the like, good tank players in Overwatch, I guess you could say. Anything that's going to have more impact on the game than them. So yeah, I'd much rather just take a high ELO, like damage or like tank player that's providing a lot of impact and convert them into a support than take a support main itself. And the seventh thing is like niche exceptions and other caveats. So I'd say that there's very few of these, but like if you're looking at high level Overwatch, for example, there's one player that comes to mind. Rafa was playing for a bit before the Quake Champions thing came out, and he was on support. And of course, you're going to be saying, well, if he was this aimer from, well, he wasn't really known as an aimer, first of all, from Quake anyway. But if he's this Quake player, they're supposed to have good aim and stuff, like, why does he not want to be on a carry? Well, that's because Rafa was always known as a more cerebral player when he played Quake anyways. And I'm thinking that if you want to be, I'm pretty sure he was the shot caller for his team. So if you want to be in that type of shot calling role or something like that, where you're guiding your team, you're impacting your team from another way that's external to the game, then something like support makes a lot of sense, right? Like it makes a lot of sense for somebody who has a great mind for the game to take up the support role so that they don't have to be involved in the most mechanically intensive plays, but then they can use their cerebral aspects to help their team win the game via shot calling, strategy, stuff like that. You know what I mean? So there are like niche examples of this, and I'm not trying to say that like everybody who plays support is basically looking to get carried, right? But I think there's like a lot of people that are playing support to try and climb. They're viewing support as an easier way to climb the ladder because they don't need as many mechanics and they don't need to really compete against other people as much in the DPS roles to like hard carry the game. They can kind of just sit back and play Lucio Mercy and play at a decent level and still gain LP, still gain ELO. If they can master doing a couple things at the right times, using their ult in the right situations and stuff like that. Whereas the DPS player kind of has to be more on all the time. They have to be like really hitting everything. They have to be doing a lot of damage in order to climb up the ladder and be most effective. So I would just encourage anybody who's trying to, actually get good at the game to play the more DPS or the carry-orientated heroes. Basically, you want to be the one, you want to develop your mechanics, your game knowledge, everything like that, right? And then if you need to play a support, you can always learn that after the fact. Whereas if you play support first, and then you try and transition to another role, like if you were to hit like Challenger in League of Legends and you try and transition as support and you try and transition to mid or AD carry, you might find it very difficult because you're sort of lacking these mechanics that weren't required. You're lacking, your game knowledge is deficient in a lot of areas. You didn't really notice as support because you didn't have as much falling on your shoulders. So definitely just try and take up the mantle of being the team's carry and play the impactful positions, learn about the game. It's harder maybe to do that, than to play the support heroes, but I think if you're actually trying to get better at the game, that's the better long-term strategy overall. So yeah, thanks for watching, and more videos to come.